Thank you so much, Peter, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to engage with your class. It's a challenge to engage with an audience of such a different, diverse background, people from physics, geography, history. So please, I'm just going to tell my story, but please just interrupt me if you have questions, if it's going too fast, if you want to pick up any of the points that I'm talking about, don't hesitate to interrupt and we can have a little discussion. So I just wanted to start, it's less than a minute, with a very brief film clip of your finance minister, your former finance minister, Michel Sapin, who after the attacks in Paris in November emphasized, placed a lot of political weight on the agenda of tracking terrorist financing. And so he really reiterated this political agenda, and this is what he said.
En mars 2015, j'ai présenté un plan de lutte contre le financement du terrorisme qui poursuivait 3 objectifs. Faire reculer l'anonymat dans l'économie afin de mieux tracer les opérations financières. Mieux surveiller, grâce à la mobilisation en particulier des acteurs financiers dans la lutte contre le terrorisme. Renforcer les capacités de gel contre les avoirs détenus par les financeurs ou les acteurs du terrorisme. L'ensemble de ce plan sera mis en œuvre totalement d'ici le premier trimestre 2016. Nous encadrerons plus strictement l'utilisation des cartes prépayées dont il a été fait usage dans les attentats du 13 novembre afin de faire reculer là aussi l'anonymat dans l'utilisation de ces cartes. Au-delà de l'émotion, il faut être dans l'action. Nous devons pour commencer agir plus vite et plus fort au niveau européen. Nous partageons un espace commun, la menace commune, il faut donc y répondre ensemble.
So what strikes you? What did you hear? Who would like to just give us a quick, my French is a little bit rusty, so who would like to give us just a quick summary? What struck you? What strikes you about what he's saying? Anyone? Maybe the economists in the back?
So he's defining 3 main axes of fight against the financing of terrorism. The first one is to fight anonymous transactions, the anonymity around the finance of terrorism. The second one is better monitoring, which, according to him, goes through the mobilization of financial actors. The third one is to reinforce the capacity to freeze the assets which are owned by actors of terrorism or financiers of terrorism. And he also mentioned at the end that it's a problem that needs to be considered at the European, so continental scale, and so we need to coordinate action.
Great, yeah, thanks. So exactly, he's emphasizing how the struggle against terrorism is first and foremost a struggle against financing. I mean, this is a slightly different quote taken from the Financial Times. And he's giving us this action plan with 3 points, as you kindly repeated for us. He talks about mieux tracer, mieux surveiller the financial flows and the financial networks. And he puts on the table also in the EU context 3 concrete proposals. First of them, and it's slightly different, I've taken the 3 points from the actual action plan that he presented. He emphasized slightly different things in his talk just now. But broadly speaking, he talks about bolstering the power of financial intelligence units, which are sort of national units that all EU member states have, where they gather suspicious transactions reports. He emphasizes the European information exchange. He's saying that among European countries, we should be much better at exchanging this type of financial information much quicker. He's talking about more effective freezing of money, people who are placed on blacklists either by the EU or by the UN. This should be more effective. This is also a point you kindly summarized for us. And talking about regulating e-money, or I think in this clip he also talks about better tracing things like prepaid telephone cards, which in the November attacks in Paris, I think it was shown afterwards that they had used prepaid telephone cards. So this, supposedly gives a measure of anonymity, which he's proposing to regulate. And it was really clear at that moment, France was really pushing this on the EU agenda very strongly. But they didn't do something entirely new or something entirely original here, because what we have seen since 9/11, of course, there's always a longer history to it than 9/11. Of course, we know we have to be careful with starting the whole geopolitical world at 9/11. There are longer histories to this policy agenda than 9/11. Nevertheless, we can sort of say, I mean, if you want to talk about geopolitics, I do think you can make the argument that 9/11, 2001, provided a kind of turning point, provided a kind of window of opportunity for certain measures to really take a flight and become much more important, and pursuing the financing of terrorism was one of them. This is something where a lot of regulation, a lot of action has taken place since 9/11. Some people speak about a new financial warfare. I leave it in quotation marks. Of course, that's a very contested term. But you see people like Juan Zarate, who was actually working inside the US Treasury at the time. He has since written his memoirs, which are called Treasury's War, and he says, the challenge would be to shape the classic financial weaponry of anti-money laundering, strategies and sanctions into a robust set of tools that could disrupt Al-Qaeda's operations. And we shouldn't think that this is purely an American invention or an American agenda, because we've seen a lot of it inside the European Union, and a lot of drive as well from the European Council and the European Commission, so much so that in a policy paper of 2013, for example, you see that the European Commission writes that financial transactions yield valuable intelligence with particular value for detection of terrorist activities and players involved. There's also a whole kind of cultural area, I would argue, around this, where the problem of terrorism financing takes shape culturally. Can anyone recognize the scene from the film? Who knows which film we're watching here? No one.
I'm embarrassed to say I do.
Well, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's Casino Royale, one of the James Bond films that was apparently fully produced and made after 9/11, where the bad guy, Le Chiffre, is a financier of terrorism. And he's portrayed in a particular sort of nihilistic way. Anyway, he's the financial mastermind. This has led to a complex regulatory landscape. Like I said, there's been lots of initiatives, action plans. We have lists that place people on blacklists where their monies become frozen. We have recommendations from the Financial Action Task Force, which is actually based here in Paris. It's an intergovernmental organization with OECD members. It's based in Paris. It's become incredibly more powerful after 9/11 because it's formulated 9 special recommendations on terrorism financing. We've seen 3 new EU money laundering directives since 9/11. We have the lists, as I mentioned. The United Nations Security Council list is the most important one, but we also have EU lists, we have national lists, we have more than 200 lists worldwide. We've seen an increase in what could be called financial surveillance. And we've also seen some let's say, some problematic aspects of this whole financial surveillance apparatus, where it has actually led to financial exclusions. It has led to the exclusion of particular types of groups and particular types of clients from the banking sector. One of the things that I want you to realize, or that I want you to think about, is that regulation in this domain is what we call risk-based. So it means that the financial institutions that have to report suspicious transactions, the financial institutions that have to look for suspicious transactions, are under a regime of risk-based regulation, which gives them a lot of authority and discretionary space to decide what they think is suspicious, right? So for example, a report from the FATF from 2007 says institutions will need to identify high-risk customers, products, and services, including delivery channels and geographical locations, right? So the FATF is saying that the bank should figure this out. The banks know best what type of customer is most high risk. The banks know best what type of financial transactions are completely normal and part of a regular pattern, and what transactions could be suspicious, should be followed or reported, and so on. That's a very brief rendering of what it means to have a risk-based regulation, is that it sort of places the authority with the regulated institution. It's up to them to undertake these risk assessments and to decide what is the best way of dealing with this. Now, this is all still a prelude to what I really want to talk about, because what I really want to talk about and the approach that we are taking in my research project is to move from a focus on this regulation and this complex regulatory landscape towards a practice-based approach. So what I'm saying is that we can study this regulation, and many people are doing it. We can study this law, and there is a lot there to study. But what I'm arguing is that if we study this regulation and this law, we still know very little about what happens in practice and what it actually means on the ground for banking practice, for financial clients, which we all are, for society at large. And there's a number of reasons why I think that a focus on regulation itself only tells us part of the story and doesn't tell us enough about practice. First is this risk-based regulation that I was just talking about, because it authorizes decentered decisions. Like I said, it places the authority, it places the assessment capacity, it places the decision-making power with the regulated institutions. In this case, financial institutions, insurance businesses, money transfer businesses, all types of financial institutions and money-remitting channels. They are the ones who have to do risk assessments and make decisions concerning what is normal, what is suspicious, and how to monitor, how to survey financial transactions. The second reason why I think a focus on regulation only takes you so far is because security knowledge in this area is profoundly contested and formed in practice. So that has something to do with the novelty of this problem. If you ask what is the financing of terrorism, how shall we monitor it? How do terrorists go about their financial business? Then you will actually find that there is no sort of canon of accepted knowledge. Nobody really knows, basically. Of course, we can trace, and we have really good reports. We can trace how the Paris November attacks were financed. Of course, we can trace that afterwards. We have really good reports of the 9/11 attackers themselves, which were put together afterwards. Also, for example, the London bombings, which are longer ago in 2005, we have these reports of how it was done afterwards, but we also have a lot of contestation in this knowledge area. So it's very difficult to, we don't really have sort of an accepted body of knowledge where practitioners or researchers would agree and sort of say, okay, this is how it's done, this is what we should be looking for. So my argument is that knowledge in this domain, to a large extent, is formed and shaped in practice precisely because we don't have, you know, a clear a canon or set of knowledge or set of research that everybody is referring to. Thirdly, I think what we see in this area is that the whole apparatus of fighting terrorism financing has a lot of effects that are not necessarily strictly related to its effectiveness, right? So if you think about effectiveness, you would think about the question, does this fulfill its goal? Are we identifying, disrupting, catching the terrorists, and so on? And there we don't have a lot of good studies. We have some studies to suggest that it's not actually very effective at all, but we have very little knowledge about how this regulation is relating to its objectives. Is it fulfilling its objectives? But what we do know, and what I think is important to sort of shift focus to, is that there are a lot of effects. So there's a lot of money invested in the banks in doing transactions monitoring, in doing compliance business. There's a huge industry growing up around this. There's a lot of effort. There's a lot of financial professionals who do this for their job. There's a lot more work that the financial intelligence units are doing. They are getting a lot more data. They are analyzing those data. But we also see a number of societal effects, and I've already briefly mentioned them. For example, where we've seen financial exclusions of groups that are considered to be too risky to bank, not necessarily because they're up to no good, but mostly because doing a risk assessment of certain types of let's say low yield customers is thought to be not very interesting for the banks. So you see a lot of effects in this area. You see a lot happening that is not necessarily strictly reducible to, let's say, an effectiveness measure. And these are the reasons why I think we need what is called a practice-based approach. These are the reasons why I think we need to study more closely what is happening in practice with all these big action plans and broad objectives that Sapin, but many other politicians before him, have set out. Any questions or comments so far? No? Okay, so what I do in my research project, which Peter has briefly introduced, which is called Project Follow, we appropriate the language of following the money, but what we want to do is to follow the suspicious transaction along what I call a chain of translation. So we understand the path of the suspicious transaction as a so-called chain of translation, whereby these transactions are collected, stored, transferred, and analyzed in order to arrive at security facts. For example, frozen assets, closed accounts, court convictions. And what I seek to do is to understand the creative and sequenced mode of security judgments across public and private spheres. So you can, I mean, and this is very schematic, but very schematically you can say that banks mine their transactions databases. They identify what are called suspicious transactions reports. They report them to financial intelligence units, which analyze these transactions again, and they may then share leads with police, who may then build a case. And my suggestion is that if we follow more precisely the financial transaction as it moves along this chain, that we can see more of the actual practice of how transactions are handled, how they are shared, how they are moved, how they are interpreted, and what kind of effects they have in the world. So just to start with an example. And following a contingent process, as I suggest to do here, I think inevitably means that we have to start in the middle of things. There is not a clear starting point. So really, just to start with an example in the middle of things, I want to show you this example of a wire transfer of slightly more than 300 euros that was made by a Dutch bus driver, Suleiman R. And it was sent from The Hague to Turkey, to middlemen in Turkey, in May 2014, via Western Union, so not via the bank. This transaction was identified as suspicious by Western Union. It was reported to the Financial Intelligence Unit, and it was believed to be a money transfer intended for the suspect's brother, who was at the time believed to be fighting in the territory of Islamic State. So this regular, normal, everyday, very small transaction of 300 euros became inscribed as a suspicious transaction, and it eventually was brought before the Court of The Hague, where it became part of the evidence. Oh, I don't have my slide with the evidence. Maybe it comes later. But anyway, this transaction of 300, together with a number of other transactions that Suleiman R. made, were brought before the Court of The Hague, and they were used in the trial to convict Suleiman R. for 2 years imprisonment for the financing of terrorism. And the court said, between September 2013 and December 2014, the suspect via middlemen in Turkey through money transfer sent money to his brother in Syria. In each case, the money amounts were intended to financially support the armed jihad battle in Syria and/or Iraq. So the trial was not necessarily about what was bought with the money in Syria or Iraq. It was not necessarily about whether or not a bomb was bought or just food. No, the fact that there was financial support of someone believed to be in IS-held territory, someone believed to be participating in armed combat, that was enough to convict the sender, his brother, to 2 years imprisonment. So for me, this example raises a number of questions concerning the process of detecting, sharing, and criminalizing transactions. First, how did this routine wire transfer of just over 300 euros materialize into court evidence that helped to secure a conviction in this case? Second, what are the risk practices and data architectures that allow this particular transaction to be identified, to be singled out, to be shared, to be moved, and to be acted upon in the name of countering jihad? And third, if I have time, but we'll see how it goes with time, but a question I'm increasingly interested in as well is how terrorism expertise is brought before the courts in these types of cases. So how does the court deal with this huge challenging question of having to say something about a transaction in Syria or Iraq where they cannot necessarily do investigations on the ground? So how does the court decide about the situation so far away and about what a financial transaction could or could not be doing there in terms of harm? So this is just one example of a much broader trend, I think, whereby security authorities increasingly require private companies to do their own risk assessments in order to see whether suspicious, nefarious things are going on their servers or in their accounts, and where security authorities are asking private companies to monitor transactions, to report suspect statements, to close accounts, and to mine their databases. So you see this, for example, as well in relation to social media companies. So increasingly we see a lot of pressure on social media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, to mine their servers for jihadist content and also to take stuff offline. We know, for example, that the UK National Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit works closely with companies. They have removed over 160,000 pieces of extremist material from the internet. Europol, which is a European police organization, they are based in The Hague. They also have something called an Internet Referral Unit, and they work together with companies to remove jihadi content offline. And Europol does not do it, does not remove material from the internet itself, but it works together with these companies like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, in order to identify and to really encourage these companies to remove the material. And that's one of the things that really interests me about it, because it means that this type of security decision, it is a security decision that this stuff cannot be in the public domain, but that decision is taken by private companies ultimately, just as the banks and the wire transfer companies are asked to make decisions concerning normality and abnormality and reporting transactions. So what this means to me, I think, is that these private companies increasingly find themselves on the front line of fighting terrorism. Okay, so these private companies, I would argue, they have to learn to see the world through a security lens. They're not just sort of deputized in security practice. They're not just sort of deputized in relation to fighting terrorism, but they are actually themselves becoming security actors in a way. And there is a tension between their commercial objectives and their profit motive, which ultimately is what motivates these companies, and how those security requirements and those security tasks sort of become mixed with their commercial function, which leads to, I guess, a kind of strange mix between these new security tasks and the existing commercial objectives. And that's what I really like about the article by Anthony Amisel and Elida Jacobson that I suggested for today, is because they show so well that these lists that come from the UN Security Council, these blacklists that the banks have to implement, that these lead to lots of practices inside banks that sit alongside their commercial objectives sort of in an awkward way, and that these things become mixed in a new way, right? So they talk about how banks sort of appropriate these lists and how these lists start to circulate inside the financial institutions in unexpected ways. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? No? Okay. I'll just continue then to talk a little bit more about this idea of what I call a chain of security. So I seek to sort of, develop this idea of a chain. The suspicious transaction is moving along a kind of chain of referral, of interpretation. And I do so by building on the work of Bruno Latour, who I think teaches just around the corner, not here or used to. I think he's just retired. But obviously, very important French thinker as well, based in Paris. And I build on his work to argue that we can visualize the path of the suspicious transaction as a chain of translation, whereby commercial transactions are collected, stored, transferred, and analyzed in order to arrive at security facts. And this conceptualization, I hope, shifts focus towards the trajectory of the suspicious transaction itself, to follow its modulations as it moves across public and private domains. The chain of security, this concept, understands knowledge production not as a nebulous process, but as a relatively sequenced order of interpretation and movement, but it doesn't necessarily need to be rigidly linear. We can understand it as a dynamic process of continuous circulation, referral, and contestation. Chains may be bungled up, they may even be circular, they may be recursive. And in order to develop this concept, I draw on Bruno Latour's book called Pandora's Hope, which is one of his older books. And in that book, he joins a field trip of scientists. Bruno Latour is interested in the question how scientific facts are made, where scientific facts come from. His argument is that good facts require a lot of work to arrive at a good, solid, durable scientific fact. That requires a long chain of mediation. It requires a lot of scientific work. And in order to explore that question of how scientific facts are made, he joins a field trip of French scientists who are going to the Amazonian forest to study climate change. And these scientists select a little area in the forest. They have a lot of debate about which area they have to be. They take soil samples, and sort of the boundary between forest and savanna is supposed to say something bigger about the state of the Amazonian forest, which may say something bigger about climate change. So for Latour, he studies this field trip, and he offers a thick description of the soil science expedition, how they collect specific samples of soil, how the soil samples are made transportable, how they are inscribed in field logs and dossiers, how they are transported back to the Parisian center of calculation. And the production of these pedagogical facts for Latour involves what he calls circulating reference, where each sequence of the process refers back to a prior object. Each step in the selection and inscription forms the basis of the next move of the scientists. This chain of reference does not involve a kind of ironclad path of scientific discovery. No, for him there is a risky intermediary pathway from the situated soil to eventually the scientific fact. At each link in the chain of collection, transportation, sampling, and analysis, there are gaps as well as continuities. At each link in the chain, there are lots of little moments of contestation and discussion. Rather than a rigid process, Latour understands this chain of translation to be a dynamic process of continuous circulation, referral, and contestation. So I argue that it's fruitful to redeploy Latour's concepts and methods in order to study the passage of a transaction from a simple digital registration to a sign of suspicion to possible evidence of wrongdoing in a chain of security. So if we liken a transaction, a financial transaction, to the soil sample, then we can render visible the practices that translate a financial record from a simple bank registration to suspicious transaction to, in some cases, not many, court evidence. And these practices do not simply move transactions along a chain, but they reinscribe their meaning, and they continuously sort of reinterpret this transaction, which then also acquires different types of capacities and meanings. So for me, this idea of a chain of security, I try to use it as what Anna Leander calls a thinking tool. She has a really nice chapter on thinking tools, things that help us think in international relations, tools that help us sort of focus and ask particular types of questions. And my suggestion is if we use this notion of a chain as a thinking tool, then we can start seeing, or better seeing, three things. First of all, how data are carved off and rendered transportable. So I think it's clear that digital data, like financial transactions, are not exactly like the soil samples that Latour talks about. Digital transactions can double, they can merge, they can be endlessly copied. The pathway of a digital transaction is fundamentally unpredictable, unlike the sort of static or more static path of the soil sample in Latour's analysis, right? The soil samples become packaged in plastic bags and boxes. They go on the ship to Paris. So I would say that the digital transaction is a slightly different type of object. They are more close to what Karin Knorr-Cetina has called epistemic objects that have the capacity to unfold indefinitely. In her argument, the incomplete, transient, and unfolding ontology of epistemic objects foregrounds what she calls the temporal structure. So Knorr-Cetina draws attention to the temporal, processual way in which unstable knowledge objects acquire what she calls, I quote, stable thinghood. So I think it's precisely in this context that appropriating Latour's approach makes sense. As with the Amazonian soil of Latour's study, data points need to be carved out from the continuous flow of the world. Data do not simply flow from one domain to another. They need to be rendered transportable, both technically and juridically. Data sets need to be identified, selected, and rendered transportable. It's not so easy as we think to make data flow. And despite the metaphor of data flow, you need a lot of good juridical work to be able to transfer data from one domain to another. Usually you need privacy guarantees, you need data protection, but you also need a lot of technical work to make data move, to be able to transfer data from, let's say, a bank to a financial intelligence unit, or from Twitter to a police report. You need technical work, you need systems that are able to talk to each other. So from that point of view, I think and I hope that this notion of the chain of translation can help us understand better how data are carved off and rendered transportable. And it focuses us on sort of understanding and studying the data architectures and the risk practices that are at work and in the different links of the chain. Secondly, I suggest that it is useful to distinguish between knowledge and judgment in order to understand situated security decision-making beyond the routine. So security practices involve difficult, disputed, and deliberative judgments. We often think of data mining and algorithmic analysis as sort of producing fully automated decisions. But at least in this example, this is not the case. Right, because these types of data analytics are more often generated through reiterative processes of data mining and deliberation. And actually, Twitter said something like this. As I mentioned earlier, Twitter is now very much charged with mining their servers and platforms for possible jihadi content. These allegedly are images of terrorist fundraising online through Twitter. And Twitter got a lot of critique from governments that they are allowing this to happen. There's a number of court cases pending, actually. They're going to be really interesting. Like, what is the responsibility of Twitter here, right? Can they be convicted for facilitating terrorism? There's 1 or 2 court cases going on in the United States. But anyway, in that context, Twitter itself sort of said, many experts and other companies have noted that there is no magic algorithm for identifying terrorist content on the internet, so global online platforms are forced to make challenging judgment calls based on very limited information and guidance, right? So they are emphasizing how difficult these types of identifications and judgments are. And really this is the case within banks and financial institutions as well, even though they're under a very different regulatory regime, a much more advanced regulatory regime in that case. The analysis, the judgment, the deliberation to report something or not is still there. You have also some automated reported reports, but I'm interested actually in the research project as well in sort of the borderline cases, in the difficult files, like what types of deliberations are going on there. And I use, to try to research this and understand this, I use the concept of situated judgment, which is developed by more French thinkers, in this case Boltanski and Thévenot. And they've done a lot of work to analyze the operations that professionals perform and the moral claims they make when rendering judgment. So how do professionals classify a novel case within existing policy templates or orders of worth? What arguments of moral justification do they use when deciding to report a transaction or pursue a case? So I think that this idea of situated judgment that Boltanski and Thévenot offer can be really useful here. An important element, of course, when it comes to automated transactions analysis is the interface between professionals and algorithmically driven software that help them spot abnormalities. And if you've had a chance to look at the article by Amisel and Jacobson, you will also see how they talk about this complicated software that is used within the financial industry. They analyze software packages like Furcosoft, filtering device that helps compliance officers and financial professionals sort of mine hundreds of thousands of transactions in order to help them spot abnormalities. Nevertheless, these types of programs and these types of algorithms never deliver fully automated security judgments. They need instructions concerning risk appetites, patterns, and thresholds, and then they are also integrated into wider professional environments in complicated ways. And next week, hopefully, you will also hear more about sort of this algorithmic data mining and the role of professionals in relation to that. Professional deliberations take place around the significance of red flags and the right follow-up actions to take place. And the production of security knowledge in this sense, I think, is an interplay between human and machine reading. It is not fully automated, but it is not, let's say, fully, it's taken in dialogue in an interface between human and machinic sense-making. Nathaniel O'Grady, who has studied risk practices in relation to the fire services, a very interesting domain as well, very different. He talks about the interface to understand the situated interaction between human and non-human agencies in making sense of risk. Thirdly, I seek in this project to critique without what Latour calls denouncing. If you've had a chance to look at the article I suggested for today, he talks about has critique run out of steam, but he says that there's a lot of critique that takes shape through a kind of denouncing. But for him, that's not a very interesting critique. He says the critic is not the one who debunks, but the one who assembles. And I think, I find that very appealing to think about this area as well. To some extent, there is a lot of debunking that we could do in relation to the financial industry, and there is a lot of debunking going on in relation to the financial industry. There's also a lot of debunking that we could do in relation to the, let's say, exclusionary effects of this whole practice of financial surveillance. There's a lot of debunking we could do in relation to its relative lack of effectiveness. But that doesn't leave us actually with so much understanding of what is going on. It leaves us with, I think, too little understanding of how things are made the way that they are made, and the moral claims and intentions that actually happen throughout this chain of translation. And what I want to do in my research project is to also really go into the field. We're going to do, with a team of PhD students, we're going to do a qualitative field work and ethnographic observations in all these sites. And I find it important that we go into these institutions without a prior normative commitment, without a prior political conclusion, let's say. But that doesn't mean that we cannot critique. In fact, I think it will enrich critique to follow this contingent process and to understand the claims and the practices throughout. And here we are also drawing on the work of Isabel Stengers, who has also talked about what she calls critique without judgment. She talks about following the contingent process that brings scientific orders into being without either ratifying or denouncing them. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. In that case, let's continue a little bit more with some of these examples. Peter, will you help me look at the time?
Yes.
We started a bit late, yeah, but you will tell me. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more. I want to take you a little bit more through these examples, like what is exactly going on here. And like I said, we often think about following the money as this kind of security dream, as long as a little bit the way Sapin lays it out at the beginning of this, the film clip that we started with, had this dream that if we can analyze the financial data, that if we can follow the money, that we can actually identify the terrorists at an early stage, that we can see where they are funded and financed. And sort of instead of this type of security dream where we would sort of with a flawless risk analysis be able to catch the bad guys, my project uses this notion of following in a different way. We want to follow the series of translations that render financial transactions into indicators of suspicion, into evidence of wrongdoing in this chain of security. And I think that mapping this process of translation captures the various moments of politics that are taking place throughout this chain. So let's continue with the, I don't have an image here, that's okay. Let's continue with the 326 euros. Remember, I gave you this example of 326 euros that was sent from The Hague to Turkey that was eventually used in the trial of the bus driver who is going to prison for 2 years. So a first link in this chain would be banks or other financial institutions, in this case, Western Union, wire transfer company. And so it is known now, I think it is not anymore secret information, that all major financial institutions and Western Union are mining their databases for transactions in particular regions in Turkey, especially borderline regions with Syria. They scrutinize cash transfers, ATM transactions, credit card spending within these specific regions in order to identify potentially suspect travel of persons en route to IS-held territories. Of course, it's recognized that there are many legitimate reasons to be spending money in that area. For example, military personnel may be stationed there, migrants may be visiting there or have family there. So in the work of banking analytics, these types of hits need to be compared and analyzed, for example, in relation to social networks, in relation to other types of transactions and client history. In this case, in relation to the 326 euros, it was translated from a regular digital record of a money transfer to an unusual transaction in the sense defined by Dutch money laundering law. The identification of unusual transactions explicitly depends on subjective indicators involving what I have called situated judgment. In a second step or a second link in this financial security chain concerns financial intelligence units, which are compulsory in all EU member states. Very little is known actually about how FYUs handle, analyze and share the suspicious transactions that they receive from financial institutions. We are hoping to be able to do research inside one of these financial intelligence units, or two even, but I'm not sure. It's going to be difficult because they're very closed institutions and there's not a lot of research that has been done. In this case, going back to the 326, the Dutch FYU processed this unusual transaction report as one of over 230,000 wire transactions reported in 2014, of which an estimated 6% was thought to be related to terrorism. And within an FYU, unusual transactions are made recombinable with other data sets as well as open source information. Our 326 abnormal transaction was subjected to this further analysis by the Dutch FYU, which may typically involve a recombination of transaction information, which is already on the international and national FYU databases, but they will also combine it with data from, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, increasingly also open source data, also tax authorities, and so on. After analysis, our 326 was declared to be suspicious, and this translation in the context of Dutch law from an abnormal transaction, as it is reported by the bank, to a suspicious transaction, as it is declared by the FYU. This is an important legal difference. It means that the transaction operates in a different data protection regime, that it can be shared with different types of actors, in this case, for example, with the police and with prosecution. And so information of this 326 was shared with Dutch police and prosecutors, which eventually arrested the sender. Oh yes, this is the FYU, how they themselves like to visualize their work. So a final link in what I'm calling a security chain here concerns the prosecution and the courts. So most suspicious transactions reports never lead to a court case, and not in relation to terrorism and not in relation to money laundering either. It's one of the big complaints actually of the financial institutions. They say we do all this reporting, but when does it ever lead to an actual conviction? But actually, I think we're going to see more convictions in this area. The Financial Action Task Force, at least in relation to terrorism financing, now says that one way in which to measure the effectiveness is by looking at court cases and court convictions, is by seeing, are people convicted for the financing of terrorism in the national context, which means, I think, that we're going to see a lot more court cases. There's been a number of controversial cases here in France. I don't know if anyone has been following them, but not so long ago, a mother, for example, was convicted of sending money to her son, who was also in IS territory. I don't remember the name of the case, but that was a prominent case going on in France. And so we will see increasingly cases in this area. And what I find interesting particularly about these types of court cases is that they involve the criminalization of terrorism facilitation, terrorism financing, and terrorist intent. So these cases are relatively far removed from, let's say, the actual terrorist violence, and they operate in a domain pre-violence, let's say. They are cases of facilitation and intent. They have to debate criminal culpability increasingly in advance of the violent act. And this is what I find so interesting about these types of cases. They're very contested cases very often. So in this case, the 326 came to function as evidence before the criminal court alongside 8 other transactions. There we have it. I mean, sorry, this is in Dutch, but this is just a picture of the actual court judgment where the 326 is listed as a piece of evidence alongside a number of other transactions made by the same suspect to his brother, totaling to about 17,000 euros. And the suspect was found guilty of multiple counts of terrorism financing and of contributing to the destabilization and insecurity in Syria. Okay, then in a further and final translation, and again, I'm sorry that this is in Dutch, but this is a screenshot of the Dutch Financial Intelligence Unit where they are talking about this example, and they're talking about this successful conviction as an example of success. And it's an anonymized example, it's a generic example. We don't recognize anymore the bus driver and his brother, and the example becomes generalized as a case of success of the work of the FYU and how well they are doing in pursuing these types of crimes and catching these types of suspects. Okay. Peter, should I move to, yeah, and it's being generalized as a financial pattern of an IS combatant, right? Which is one of the things that I find interesting about this, is that this singular case becomes generalized as an example of the financial patterns of IS combatants. So there's a particular type of, generalization, I think, going on that at least for the social scientists in this room, would be questionable to generalize from one case. Maybe it makes sense, Peter, if I move to some conclusions. Is that a good?
30 minutes more.
Yeah, so then we have about 30 minutes for discussion. Yeah, I mean, I have some more material, but maybe we can talk about it in relation to the questions as well about how these court cases take place and how these court cases unfold and how the court says something about the situation in Syria, right? So they don't actually have a lot of evidence of what went on with the money inside Syria because they have no eyewitnesses, they have no records beyond Turkey, right? Because then it becomes all cash. So it's very difficult for the court to make a kind of assessment of the life situation under IS-held territory and what this transaction actually did in the end. So I have now lots of questions about how expertise is brought before the court in these types of cases. But let's see if there's questions about that in the discussion. Let me just conclude very briefly by saying that what I'm interested in and what I hope this notion of a chain of security can help us do is to analyze how risk is practiced, right? So this was my argument from the beginning. Looking at the risk regulation, looking at the law only tells us very little about how risk is actually practiced, how financial transactions are filtered, how financial institutions are reorienting their practices, building their own software systems, making their complicated judgments. So all of these things, I think, are questions of risk practice rather than risk regulation. I'm interested, and I hope this notion of the chain can help us think about how risk is dispersed throughout this chain. So there is not sort of one decision on whether something is risky or not. There is never one decision of risk assessment or risk measurement, because this transaction is continually reassessed. And the risk models inside a bank are different from the risk models inside an FYU. And our transaction, let's say our 326 that we try to follow, does different things in the different institutional domains. It becomes interpreted differently. It becomes risk assessed differently. It mingles with other types of transactions and other types of risk calculation, which means that the risk assessment and the security decision is dispersed throughout this chain rather than taking place, let's say, in one clear moment or one place. And partly, I think that the chain can also tell us a story about how risk is displaced. So we cannot eventually, I think, ever say that the risk has been addressed, or the risk has been countered, or the risk has been fully hedged. You see a displacement of risk. And in this case, the example that we've seen is that actually some types of client groups are now being kicked out of the financial system just because banks are saying that it's so difficult to continuously offer a refined risk assessment of their types of transactions. For example, if you send, let's say, smaller amounts to places like Somalia, it just becomes very difficult for financial institutions to do a full fine-grained risk analysis, which means that risk becomes displaced, people are being debanked, and cash transfers may actually be on the rise in that example. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thanks.